The perfume on his jacket, it wasn't mine. That's when it started, the little sliver of doubt. That evening, I brushed it aside, pretended it was leftover from some woman at the office. But the seed was planted. His work trip fell on the same weekend as Lisa's big reunion bash. I told him it was just girls, a little lie to let loose. We always joked about me cutting loose while he was gone, but that night felt different. The club was all lights and pounding music, and the drinks flowed too freely. Then I saw him, Jake, across the room, and for a second, it was like we were back in college. We'd always teased about something happening. The years melted away, replaced by a heat that had nothing to do with the crowded room. It's funny how a few drinks and good music can warp things. His hand on my back felt dangerous, thrilling. I shouldn't have let it go any further, but the truth is, I wanted it to. And as the taxi blurred past and we fumbled with keys at my apartment door, my common sense went up in smoke. The next few weeks were a messy tangle. My life turned into little lies, fake phone calls, excuses about running late. I was stealing moments with Jake, moments that felt electric and desperate, all fueled by the thrill of doing the wrong thing. We'd hide out in cheap cafes or even his sparse apartment, every touch and whisper tainted by a guilt that gnawed at me. The trouble was, it also felt good. I thought about Jake when I should have been thinking about my husband, about our life. I told myself it was harmless, a rebellious streak I needed to get out of my system. But that floral perfume lingered in the back of my mind. Did it linger on me, too? Each stolen moment deepened the divide. The nights I came home late, my husband's questions in his eyes, made the shame cut deeper. I didn't know how to stop. I wanted to stop, but then Jake would send a sly text, and the thrill would beat back the worry. It was a dance with the devil, and I was losing my grip on the lead. Every shared meme with Jake felt like a tiny betrayal. Work gossip morphed into conversations threaded with double meanings, jokes that only we understood. Looking over my shoulder became habit, and a jolt of panic went through me every time my husband came near while I was glued to my phone. Late night at the office again? He'd raise an eyebrow, and the words sounded more suspicious each time. I'd mumble an excuse under my breath, my stomach twisting. I started inventing fake calls with old friends just to explain why I was glued to the damn screen. Then came the stolen lunches. Our thing. The rush of getting out of the office, the thrill of sitting side by side in tucked-away cafes no one would recognize. I began to learn new things about Jake, his favorite sandwich order, a nervous habit of drumming his fingers. And his touch, it wasn't just lust anymore, it was an undercurrent of something deeper, something terrifying. The first time I went to his apartment, I knew I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. It wasn't fancy, just plain white walls and sparse furniture. But within those walls, everything felt intensified. The forbidden aspect of it only seemed to heighten the passion, the guilt. Walking back into my own house afterward, every familiar object felt like an accusation. The tie my husband had tossed carelessly on the chair seemed to burn my eyes, whispering the word, betrayal, over and over. The lies, the stolen hours, the fading scent of his cologne on my skin, it all pressed down, suffocating me. Each day blended into the next. Routine mornings pretending all was normal, frantic lunch breaks fueled by desire, and those empty evenings echoing with unspoken guilt. Every text was a fire I couldn't put out. Every whispered word with another man was a hammer blow against the foundation of my marriage. I was falling apart, even as I fell deeper for Jake. And I knew, deep down, it was only a matter of time until it all came crashing down. I started seeing threats everywhere. A linger glance at the grocery store, an overheard whisper in the office. It felt like the whole world was in on my secret, waiting for me to slip up. Ordinary moments turned into a minefield of potential exposure. The lies got heavier too. Elaborate excuses about work projects, phantom calls from old friends I hadn't spoken to in years. I looked at myself in the mirror and was shocked by the stranger staring back, hollow eyes, a smile that looked painted on. I was living a double life, split down the middle with no way to heal the crack. And yet, the pull toward Jake didn't ease. Every shared look, every touch, it was fire, and I was drawn to it like a moth, regardless of the consequences. It disgusted me how much I wanted it, craved it. But the shame, the guilt, was a constant shadow. Walks home were lead-in, each step reminding me of how far I'd strayed. I'd pass shops we frequented together, the familiar ache of betrayal twisting in my gut. And when I finally got home, our wedding photo seemed like a slap in the face. One night, I finally gave in, turned it face down on the dresser, a pathetic act of defiance. Worst of all were the evenings with my husband. The chasm between us yawned wider with each strained conversation. He'd try to crack a joke, and it would fall flat, disappearing into the awkward silence. My attempts to sound normal felt forced, hollow. Every bite of dinner tasted like deceit, and I was choking on it. He wasn't stupid, that much I knew. I saw growing suspicion cloud his eyes, but I didn't know if it was about Jake or just the slow disintegration of everything we'd built. The not knowing, the waiting for the other shoe to drop, made me feel like I was going insane. I was trapped by my own deceit, a knot of lies twisting tighter with every passing day. His eyes lingered on my phone screen too long one morning, a spark of suspicion dimming their usual warmth. It was like a lit fuse, and I snapped before I could think. A petty argument about something stupid flared into a mess of angry words, accusations I barely even understood myself. There was no stopping it, the pent-up guilt bubbling over into rage I couldn't control. He didn't fight back, which was even worse. He just sat there, picking at his food. He used to love this meal, but now he pushed the food around his plate, eyes downcast. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, and I was the conductor. Then came the change, the late-night walks. He'd come back hours later, a distant look in his eyes, like he'd been battling something I couldn't see. At first, a flicker of perverse relief washed over me. Was he finally on to someone else? A taste of his own medicine? But the relief curdled into something bitter. Was he even thinking of me anymore? Or was our marriage just a shadow he was starting to walk right through? Then, that damn text. It popped up during a routine staff meeting, Jake's name flashing across the screen. Can't stop thinking about you. Panic twisted with a dark pleasure inside me. I deleted it fast, fingers shaking, but the echo of those words wouldn't leave. They wormed their way into my thoughts, a forbidden mantra. The days became a blur of fear and adrenaline. Work was a torture chamber where every ring of my phone was a potential disaster. Home was no better. The silences stretched into chasms, filled with suspicion and the ghost of what we used to have. I was a wreck. One part of me screamed to confess, to rip the bandage off and just face whatever came next. The other part. That part was still hooked on the high wire rush of keeping my secret, desperate for one more fix of Jake before I finally crashed and burned. I was a goddamn mess, and the worst part was, I knew exactly who to blame. The doorbell shattered my fragile peace. There stood my husband, a smile on his face and a small, neatly wrapped box in his hands. "Happy birthday," he said, his eyes hopeful, just like they used to be. As I unwrapped the gift, guilt pierced me. A beautiful necklace, chosen with care. It shimmered on my neck, feeling more like a noose with every passing second. This man, who loved me, had no idea how deeply I'd betrayed his trust. Worse was to follow. "Surprise," he announced. "I booked us a weekend getaway. Remember that place we honeymooned?" I figured it was time for some romance. My world seemed to tilt on its axis. That hotel, where we'd started our life together, was now a loaded weapon. Each smile he gave sent a fresh wave of shame crashing over me. I couldn't bring myself to tell him no. "We need to stop," I texted Jake later that day. There was no question, I had to try. But before the message could even send, his reply came, "No. I'm coming over." A desperate back and forth ensued. Me pleading to end it, him insistent. Then, his voice on the line, rough and laced with a need that mirrored my own. I almost caved, but as I hung up, the thought of my husband, so excited about our trip, sliced into me. The weekend was torture. We played at being us again, but every forced smile, every stolen glance in the direction of my phone, felt like a fresh cut. In our honeymoon suite, with its echoes of happier times, any lingering desire turned to ash. I couldn't look my husband in the eye, knowing with each touch, it wasn't him I was thinking about. The drive home was pure agony. I kept replaying the weekend, every lie, every fake laugh. He chatted about his week, oblivious, while on the brink of shattering it all. The confession bubbled in my throat, but something held me back. Cowardice? Or a desperate hope that I could bury this mess deep enough and it might disappear? After the disastrous weekend, life became a strange blur. The normalcy of grocery runs or making dinner felt like a cruel charade. My secret pressed down on me, suffocating. The air in our house seemed stale with unspoken accusations. I'd wake from nightmares, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, the warmth of my husband's body next to mine a strange, unwelcome comfort. One afternoon at the supermarket, the same damn floral perfume hit me like a punch. My heart pounded as I spotted a woman browsing the wine aisle. Could it be her, the woman from Jake's office? I ducked behind a display of cereal boxes, holding my breath until she passed. Paranoia was my new best friend. Every text from Jake was a ticking time bomb. Today it said, "Just got your favorite flowers." My blood ran cold. Was this a gesture of sweetness or a twisted trap? Did he know my husband was trying to win me back? One evening, after pretending to work late, I found myself parked outside Jake's building. I just wanted a glimpse of him, a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, besides this bone-deep exhaustion. I should have driven away. But instead, my feet led me to his door. "I have to talk to you." I choked out the words before I could change my mind. "I can't do this anymore, Jake, I can't." His eyes widened in surprise. His hand brushed mine, sending a jolt of traitorous electricity down my arm. Was this the end, or a horrifying new beginning? I couldn't decide which was worse. All I knew was that I'd set off an explosion, and there was no telling who'd get caught in the blast. My legs felt like stone as I navigated those echoing stairs, each step towards Jake's door a heavy weight against the knot in my stomach. The knock on his door hung in the air, one knock, then another, fueled by a mix of desperation and dread. When the door creaked open, my heart leapt. But it wasn't Jake. A woman stood there, late 30s maybe, hair haphazardly tied back, a touch of defiance in her eyes. She stared at me, a flicker of curiosity sparking in her gaze. "Is Alex here?" My voice came out as a whisper, the wrong name catching in my throat. It was meant to be Jake who was supposed to answer that door. She let out a bitter laugh. "Alex? Moved out weeks ago. Guess you haven't been around much lately, have you? You his wife, darling?" The word, wife, hung in the air, accusatory and mocking. My vision blurred as the bottom dropped out of my world. He'd lied, not just to me, not just about us, about everything. I fumbled for something to say, but the words wouldn't come. The woman in the doorway watched my meltdown with a mix of pity and scorn. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in that hallway, a swirl of shock and betrayal threatening to pull me under. Finally, I turned. Each step away was a step into a whole new nightmare. Had Jake been playing me this whole time? Had our whole stolen affair been some sick joke to him? Was I the fling, the disposable one left behind when he moved on? Anger ignited beneath the humiliation, pushing me forward. I raced down the stairs, a broken sob escaping me. In the half-light of the parking lot, I fumbled for my phone, tears blurring the screen. There was only one thing I could do, one person who deserved the raw, ugly truth. My fingers trembled as I hit my husband's number. It was time I stopped running. It was time for him to know. The woman's bitter words echoed in my head like nails in a coffin. Moved out. Was this all a sick game? My fingers shook as I got into my car. The drive home blurred into streaks of headlights and tears, the world warping around my burning humiliation. Stumbling into our house felt like walking into a funeral. Every picture, every carefully chosen knick-knack seemed to taunt me. Our reflection in the hallway mirror warped into something hideous. The pathetic, broken wife, her hair disheveled, eyes red-rimmed. Before I could stop myself, my fist struck the mirror. It shattered with a satisfying crack, mirroring the fractured mess inside me. His coffee mug, the one with the silly inside joke, sat innocently on the kitchen counter. A white-hot rage coursed through me. With a scream, I hurled the mug against the wall. It exploded in a shower of ceramic, the noise echoing the explosive collapse of my own carefully constructed lies. Then, amidst the shards, his phone. It was like a weapon lying in wait. An irresistible, dangerous impulse. I grabbed it, fingers trembling. I'd never done this before, invaded his privacy that way. But after everything, didn't I deserve to know? Didn't I deserve something? The screen lit up with the swipe of my thumb, and I braced myself. Texts with colleagues, boring work updates, then a photo. My throat tightened. It was him with a woman, smiling at a beach I'd never seen. Her name sent a bolt of lightning down my spine. Sarah. Quiet, efficient Sarah from accounting, the one I hadn't even considered a threat. The irony cut like a knife. Betrayal was a cruel boomerang, and now I was the one bleeding. I didn't know if I was furious at finding his new happiness or at the utter demolition of my pathetic, fragile hope that Jake meant something real. Maybe I was just angry at myself, and at the broken woman I'd become. My fingers gripped his phone so tightly I thought it might crack. Sarah. That name kept stabbing at me, twisting the knife already lodged in my gut. All those office jokes, those shared lunches, were they shared with her too? Had everyone been laughing at me behind my back? The bile rose in my throat, a bitter mix of rage and shame. I swiped through the messages, hoping for a confession, some incriminating evidence. But there was nothing. Just boring office stuff, coordination for an upcoming project. Yet, the picture of them, him grinning with his arm around Sarah, told a story of its own. That beach looked so far away, a world where I'd never existed. A wave of nausea crashed over me, a delayed shock that threatened to buckle my knees. Then, the sound that snapped me back to the present, his footsteps on the stairs. My breath caught in my chest, a panicked animal in a trap. What would I say? What could I say? He came through the door, surprised smile fading as he noticed the mess. Whoa, what happened here? He eyed the shattered mug, wariness creeping into his voice. I opened my mouth, but then it was too late. Every lie, every excuse I'd concocted, seemed to vanish. All I could do was look at him, and the understanding in his eyes was somehow worse than any accusation. The air between us thickened with unspoken truths, stretching and snapping like an over-tightened wire. He didn't have to say a word. We both knew, finally, that everything was over. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. I know. It felt like a confession dragged from some deep, forbidden corner of my soul. He went still, his face draining of color. The takeout bags hit the ground with a muffled thud, the only sound in that horrible, stretched-out silence. I watched his eyes search mine, a flicker of desperation warring with cold comprehension. An eternity passed. He waited for me to continue, for me to tear open the wound further. But the words refused to come. How could I begin to explain the trail of lies, the betrayal? With a step, then another, he moved towards me. There was a darkness in his eyes I hadn't seen before, his usual gentle warmth replaced by something sharp and wounded. How long? His voice was a hoarse whisper, laced with the raw edge of his own pain. It mirrored the agony twisting in my gut. Suddenly, he seemed older, a stranger in the man I thought I knew. The air between us was thick with accusations. For his own secret happiness, for my shameful deception. Yet, a twisted relief washed over me. It was out there, the truth we'd both tiptoed around. There was a terrible kind of freedom in the devastation, in this long overdue moment of reckoning. I didn't answer his question. I didn't know if I even could. All I knew was that this moment, this shared desolation, was where it all ended. Our marriage, built on affection and habit, had just shattered into pieces too small to repair. The only question remaining was how much more damage the fallout would cause.